This episode is part of the EUTERPE podcast series on European literatures and gender from a transnational perspective.
Welcome to the first lecture of our second summer university EUTERPE school, and it is my very special both pleasure and honor to greet Professor Sandra Ponzanesi, whom most of you know very well as a member of the consortium, or some of you as a professor and supervisor. But we are really happy that Sandra accepted to talk to us today. And before giving her the floor, I just want to remind you of some facts that we have to have in mind before listening to Sandra. Professor Ponzanesi is a chair and professor of media, gender, and postcolonial studies at the Department of Media and Cultural Studies, Utrecht University, Netherlands. And when you open her page, you actually get stunned with the number of publications. I'm always amazed, envious to a certain extent. That's really incredible. And the scope also of your research is stunning. So, this is something that always amazes me. Let me tell you just what are the areas in which he has published widely: postcolonial studies, postcolonial critique, transnational feminist studies. And I want to say that actually in the consortium, Sandra was among the members of the consortium who started working on transnational women's literature very, very early. And when we had the chance to start working together on this, I felt it like, okay, that's really something very special for us all. So, I have to recognize that from the perspective of EUTERPE. And then Italian colonialism, postcolonial cinema, digital media, and migration studies. So you have to publish a lot to cover all of that. So among her publications, there are Paradoxes of Postcolonial Critique, Postcolonial Cultural Industry, Gender Globalization and Violence. She has also co-edited a number of volumes, and I'm going to manage only some. Creating Europe from the Margins, published in 23, Postcolonial Publics, Art and Citizen Media in Europe, also in 23, Postcolonial Intellectuals in Europe, 2018, Postcolonial Transitions in Europe, 2016, and it goes on. But I also want to mention that you are also working in a number of research projects apart from EUTERPE. So put together, let me just mention some: Virtual Reality as Empathy Machine, Media Migration and the Humanitarian Predicament. Then, of course, there's EUTERPE. Then there is Digital Crossing in Europe, Gender, Diaspora and Belonging. And cutting a vein across, I just want to add that Professor Ponzanesi is founder and director of the Postcolonial Studies Initiative. So I don't know how you manage. I admire all that work, and I'm giving you the stage. So thank you, Sandra, for offering us the lecture. And the lecture is going to be given under the title Postcolonial Europe and its Intellectuals, Feminist and Transnational Perspectives.
Thank you, Jasmina, and also Petra and all the EUTERPE project for inviting me to give this lecture, which meant that I had to dive a little bit back into my work on postcolonial Europe, which has always been in parallel with my work on media and digital migration. So it's interesting how to think back actually has helped me to clarify some of the positions that I've taken in the past. And it is nice that I wanted to discuss this thing about postcolonial Europe because you have EUTERPE. It's about European literature from a gender and transnational perspective. So Jasmina already mentioned that I published Migrant Cartography at the beginning of 2000, in which we really try to think about writers across Europe in different national constituencies and the way in which they actually produce an overcoupling idea of Europe from above the national enclaves. So here in this EUTERPE as well, we have this focus on the transnational, on Europe, but what do we actually mean by Europe? Who is in it? Who is not in it? When do we think of boundaries and borders of Europe? Do we think it only geographically? Do we think of it also historically? We have to think of Europe also in deep time. Deep time means it's not just the contemporary period, but we go back a long time, and then we see that Europe is shaped very differently. If you think of the Roman Empire, the Ottoman Empire, the Moorish kingdom in Spain, you have all different kind of entanglements that might come back into the present, but they have articulated very different roots and routes of Europe itself. So maybe what do we mean by Europe? It's good to start with a list. List is only kind of useful. We can define it, as we mentioned, geographically. It is a continent, the region up to the Caucasus. Or we can think historically when to start, and then we can think of the birth of the nation states in Europe, which of course is connecting to the European and military imperial expansion. So it's very much connected to colonialism. So it's a double bind in this, within and without, beyond Europe. And sometimes we think it is a kind of linguistic homogeneity, even though there are many languages, but most of them are Indo-European, with exception of some, the Basque, the Europhonic, and some others. But we think in a way there is a unity, which was mostly, we tend to think of Europe now in terms of the European Union, despite of all the crises and the Brexit and the fragmentation, a project that has really tried to bring Europe to peace and trying to move beyond the atrocities and the violence of World War II, World War I, the Holocaust, the never again. That was something that was very important for creating a new political and economic unity. However, this never again was this idea of expelling the violence of Europe was predicated upon the idea that Europe was still a colonial power. For example, in the 50s, you still had the French-Algerian war going on. Algeria was seen pretty much as part of the French Empire and therefore of Europe. But the war of independence, the war of resistance, the violence connected to it was not seen as part of Europe. So it's interesting to see in what way Europe defined itself and create its own margins. And then you have the financial definition, the Euro course, so the presence of the military, the NATO, the alliance with the North American stuff. But we usually think of Europe more as a concept. It's an ideological construction. We tend to see it as kind of the cradle of Western civilization, starting from Greece. And we have this idea that Europe is very kind of homogeneous. It's usually seen as kind of white Christian bulwark in which all kind of other races and ethnicity are seen as invasive and breaking down this idea of homogeneity and serenity that you would have. So Europe is seen as a secular place, but this is, of course, the default position for seeing Europe as Christian, and also Europe is usually seen as white, again, the default position for not including all the other ethnicities that, as Paul Gilroy is saying, there ain't no black in the Union Jack. It means the idea of Britishness and blackness are considered to be mutually exclusive for the idea of British citizenship. So it's something that Europe really needs to work on. What kind of definition does it want to have? Is it an ideal? Is it more an aspiration? So something that we still have to strive for, would be an ideal crucible of languages, of beliefs, of values, and of different tradition and heritages. So you see that Europe, the borders are very much troubled. You know the history of migration and diaspora that we have to include into Europe. But here you have all these different routes from Africa, from the Middle East, all kinds of routes going to Spain, to Lampedusa, or to the Balkan route. And usually these kind of flows, which are actually justified under the principle that mobility is a human right. These flows are seen as form of invasion, of tsunami, of kind of flood, never a part of Europe and the responsibility of Europe of its own colonial past and created migration routes now. So if we want to start from the beginning, we said Europe often sees itself as this cradle of civilization. We started with Greece. Let's start with Greece then. We have the idea of Europe. This is young woman, Europa, who Phoenician woman who was abducted by Zeus. Zeus is the chief of all gods, who disguised himself as a white bull. And you have this iconography on a lot of ceramics and coins in the past, also in more recent paintings. So the idea of Europe is actually based on this notion of gender violence. EUTERPE, Europa gave the name to Europe, a whole continent, with a reminder of this kind of gender rape. And it's also very much present on the coins. I don't know whether you have one. I do have one by chance. You know that the euro has all the same front, but on the back it's minted differently for each country. So this one is from Greece, and I happen to have one. It's you can see here, it's of course Europa and the bull. So it's very nice to see the way in which this myth is continued and integrated in this idea of the European Union and the euro and all the things that I was mentioning to you before. So I would like now to share with you, I've been invested in this idea of post-colonial Europe for many years. So I will pass on the review some of the thinkers that have been most influential for me, and I think maybe more useful to you for your own different projects in EUTERPE. And without just dropping name and trying to see in what way we can mobilize them to see Europe differently. So you might know Luisa Passerini. Luisa Passerini is a famous oral historian, Italian, cultural memory specialist. And she has written a lot on this idea of Europe that has to be seen not so much as a geographical project or a political space, but she says Europe should be seen as an emotional project, something that we should envision as an imagined territory rather than a self-proclaimed and arrogant identity. So Europe is not this kind of self-important thing, but it's a place for doubt, absences, and shortcoming. So we have to see really Europe that has to be accountable for many painful and violent connections. We mentioned already the World War, the Holocaust, but also present resurgence of racism, xenophobia, and many right-wing ideologies that are much upcoming in Europe today. So sometimes the right-wing ideology are more united across Europe, even though they do not recognize Europe as an important entity than the left-wing ideology. So how do we think about Europe as a post-colonial space? That's something that I want to emphasize here. It is post-colonial in the sense that the post-colonial is not about the periphery, it's not about the countries far away out there, but the post-colonial is very much at the heart of Europe, not only through migration, but through the way in which we rethink and we revisit this idea of Europe. And we account for the untold and forgotten history told from institutional position, but also from more marginalized one. We have to unthink Europe, deconstruct Europe in a global context. And I think this is also the major task of the EUTERPE project, trying to collect and think through and with all these artists and writers who help us to rethink Europe from different position and different perspective. And this is important. We go again to Paul Gilroy. You all know him, great sociologist, race theory scholar. Europe is not an innocent place. It's really, it cannot be thought outside of these histories of colonial expropriation and violence, as he called it. The imperial and colonial past continues to shape the political life of underdeveloped but no longer imperial countries. So we have to think that this idea of Gilroy modernity is not something of the West. And over there you have the backwardness and the civilization that need to be imparted. But modernity actually started with the peripheries, where the question of extraction and appropriation begins with imperial projects. And these very peripheries, of course, through the different empire, Belgium, France, Spain, Italy, and the Netherlands, we need to account for all of them, is actually what made modernity possible. So there is no division, there is actually a continuum, which of course is not only equal and justifiable with the same resources. So we have to speak about the lingering, but usually unspoken colonial relations and imperial fantasies. So this is why we have to rethink Europe from the many peripheries in which migration and diaspora are very much central and has been mobilized by colonialism, decolonization, and neocolonialism, which are now the central element of this reconfiguration of Europe. And I want to bring forward another thinker who we all love, of course, Stuart Hall, a Jamaican critic who lived in the UK for a very long time and was the founder of the Birmingham School for Cultural Studies in the 70s, who have been thinking about identities, diaspora, mediation from different positions, and he has also been embracing the notion of popular culture, not high culture, but also popular culture as an important way of becoming political and embattled. And he wrote an important essay, which is included in the book by Luisa Pastorini that you saw before, in which he has this dialogue with C.L. James, another cultural historian from the Caribbean, and said, I am, but not of Europe. So it talks about migrant and diasporic intellectuals in general who happen to shape the cultural life of Europe, but they're still seen as kind of marginal or outsiders. So then there are in it, but not belonging to it. And it's a very interesting way of seeing this oblique relationship to question of belonging to Europe or not. And also more generically say, where does Europe begin and end? We already mentioned it, as it always existed. If not, when did it start? What is new Europe relation to its past? Which part of Europe belong to the idea of Europe and which do not? So it's really about thinking through the operation of inclusion and exclusion that are done not only at geopolitical level, but very much also ideological. And this is important because in an era of globalization, we think the boundaries and borders have been eliminated, but of course, they're actually being reproducing for those people's mobility is impeded. So we have to think of borders more as method than a real linear material and frontier, to think more the idea of the material, symbolic, and also political together. And this brings me to another thinker, and I'm going to give you a review of some of the most important thinkers in Europe. Of course, you might know many of them, you might have used them in your work. If not, I really encourage you to think with them as well. And Etienne Balibar was a very famous philosopher. He was French. He was a student of Althusser. He said that the borders of Europe are uncertain. It doesn't mean that with the refencing of Europe, they have this paradox. You have a refencing of Fortress Europe all the time, but the borders are vacillating. But they are not just being eliminated, they're being replaced by multiple invisible and internal borders that form new form of inclusion and exclusion based on linguistic, racial, ethnic, and religious division. So he said this new internal border actually, a new form of much more in disguise form of ideological, racialized, and politicized way of creating inclusion and exclusion, what he calls European apartheid. It's a term that he developed and then he took it back, but it's very powerful to think through this notion as well. So we have this idea of Europe very much from the top down as an institutional sovereign place, but we have to think also of Europe as something which comes from the bottom up. And here, Fatima El-Tayeb, who is also a very important scholar for Germany, but working now in the United States, a sociologist, she sees Europeanization from below. So Europe is not something which is out there, stable, but something that has to be nourished from its root, from the bottom up, from this kind of minority movement, through their performances, through their artistic and creative practices, actually create that sense of Europe, and also repropose and relieve the suppressed colonial history and make Europe accountable for the presence of the other, but also enlarged to include all these other, which can be youth minority or Muslim minorities or kind of gender minorities and European others in general. Queer minorities also included here. And this is to avoid that Europe becomes this process on the one hand of Eurocentrism, which is how the ideology of the Enlightenment, universalism, exceptionality is spread around the world. Europe as its center with its values, its beliefs, its systems. But we have to avoid also what Filomena has said, as a Dutch scholar also working in the United States, Europeism. Europeism is a bit of a different term, which is this centripetal force that makes Europe turn into itself and want to avoid all external forces, uncivilized elements, and want to be purged and cleansed of all these elements that can actually be seen as threatening to the idea of unity that Europe thinks to have, of course, which is it's never been, but it's the idea there is a beginning in which everything was homogeneous and coherent. And that's also linked to what Arjuna Padurai called the fear of small numbers. The presence of migrants or refugees in Europe is actually quite small, but this is the idea of disrupting the idea of homogeneity and unity that is most pernicious. So we have to be very careful to see that this notion of Europe does not become defined by its geographical and political boundaries. Whether we want to think it as an ideal and an illusion, we really have to be careful not to create this operation of inclusion and exclusion we propose in the name of an ideal of Europe, which is very much not unity in diversity as the European motto proclaims, but more the idea of fortress Europe, which is really not sustainable. So here, again, Balibar, face-to-face with Zygmunt Bauman, very famous sociologist as well. So you have this idea of Europe as something which is much in crisis. We had the 2008 economic crisis, the issues of Greece, the European Union almost tumbling down because of that. The double bind of Europe, on the one hand, is very much needed. On the other hand, it is not sustainable. We have growing inequalities, unhappy identities, uprooted population, how to move forward with Europe together. And on the other hand, we have this aspirational project, utopian project, that Zygmunt Bauman calls Europe as an unfinished adventure. So it's something that we need to strive for. It is an unfinished business. It's not something that we are there yet, but it's something that we cannot not want. So it's something that we have to keep working with. To close a little bit with this first section on postcolonial Europe, refer to this ambivalence of Europe both as a concept and as a project. It questions the relevance of its singularity in an era where boundaries and national sovereignty are increasingly eroded, but also posit a revisiting of the missions and ideals of the European project by including submerged perspective and new interdisciplinary take. So this post-colonial perspective of Europe is actually necessary to move forward using comparative perspective, like we did with the EUTERPE project, shedding light on contemporary conflict and crisis, not shying away from them, seeing how the past resonates and inform the present in order to indicate future trajectory, which account for transnational and cosmopolitan relations. So this is what we want Europe to be, and we want Europe also to do. So it's also a practice, it's not just a concept. So I will move now to the second part of this lecture, something that I'm also very engaged with, which is this notion of postcolonial intellectuals in Europe. Who are the intellectuals? We usually think intellectual as part of the ivory tower, a very charismatic figure who occupy this public sphere, the public space. They're very kind of iconic, and they represent constituencies of their own ethnic groups, of nationalities. They speak up, they are spokesperson, and they're very much in the mainstream of the public opinion. And they used to be very iconic figure. You still have Chomsky, for example, but now with the social media, there is a bit of fragmentation. He's actually an intellectual. Everyone can actually have an audience and followers. So it's becoming a little bit more diluted. But the intellectual is, of course, about knowledge production and the way in which you mobilize opinions. It started with the Dreyfus affair in France, in which this military soldier had been discharged. And all the writers for Émile Zola took up action in defense of Dreyfus, who had been wrongly accused and discharged. And all these intellectuals mobilized their public opinion in the press, say that it was a kind of anti-Semitic charge and it had to be reinstalled. So here the public opinion is beyond the legal or political system. It's really about cultural operators who can change mind and public opinion. And one who has been thinking about this function and role of an intellectual more thoroughly is, of course, Antonio Gramsci, who you might know, this Italian intellectual who founded the Communist Party in Italy, and he was imprisoned by fascism, and he died in prison. But while there, he's been very prolific and productive. He wrote his prison notebooks. The up-to-date are being translated, annotated, explained by many international critics, and it's many concepts, including this of the intellectual that I mentioned now, but also the hegemony and the subaltern, have influenced cultural studies and postcolonial theory many decades later. So it's been like a pioneer of what will come later on. And in prison notebooks, he makes this important distinction of the intellectual being traditional intellectual versus organic intellectual. So traditional intellectual are those like me. I'm an academic, I'm a teacher. I have the possibility of speaking in public, of giving lecture, or they can be politician, policy expert, journalist. Those are people who are intellectual because of their profession, but they remain within their system. They are not breaking boundaries like organic intellectuals do. Organic intellectuals actually using their position to organize interest and to mobilize opinions and make sure that the status quo is changed. So the kind of more radical figure who really do something in order to mobilize society in different ways. And this is a little bit the position that we have with iconic figure like Edward Said. Is seen as the beginning of postcolonial theory with its Orientalism published in 1978, and which is generating a maelstream of responses and accolade, but also critique. Is the first one to really use cultural theory to rethink the relation between the West and the rest, as much he saw the 9/11 actually coming up, and he had to live through it. But just to go to this notion of the intellectual, he never said that he was a postcolonial scholar. Everyone embraced him as the first postcolonial scholar, even though there's precedents to him, like Frantz Fanon. He never wanted to be limited to the idea of postcolonial critique and postcolonial theory, but he always said that he was an intellectual. He always said in many interviews, I see myself an intellectual. And he's also been a very much embattled intellectual who fought from the beginning for the cause of Palestine. He was of Palestinian origin, who grew up in Egypt and spent most of his life in the United States and at Columbia, where he lived until the very end. And in this series of lectures that he gave for the BBC in the 19th, called Representation of the Intellectual, he really thinks through his own position as an intellectual, but also what is the role of intellectual. They're usually seen as democracy helpers. Intellectuals are a very important function in society, really to make sure that certain standards are respected and certain groups are being marginalized and disenfranchised find a podium and a voice through them. So it's very much with this idea that an intellectual is someone who is in exile or is marginal and an amateur, and as someone actually speaks truth to power. So that speak truth to power, those are people who really are in battle with their own ideas and with their own opinion. And exile here is not just seen as an actual thing or living outside of your own country, but also as a metaphorical status for which you feel, well, it's a little bit in between, out of place. As I said about himself, is also a novel, a memoir. He wrote a memoir called Out of Place. So this kind of someone who is really outside of his own habitat, and therefore unsettled and unsettling, but also very much uncompromising. And because of this kind of position of liminality, is someone who has possibility of double insight into realities that not otherwise would not emerge. So this is interesting to think, what is the position of these intellectuals in Europe? When do they belong to Europe? When do they not? And also to think about the function and the role of the intellectual through a gender perspective and a postcolonial perspective, because we can take for granted that some Western intellectual can speak for the other. So there is an issue with the politics of representation that is here reasoned by Gayatri Spivak. Of course, you all know as one of the trinity of postcolonial studies. You have Said, Baba, and Spivak, the one who really introduced the gender element, the feminist axis, into this debate. And I say Western intellectuals sometimes do not understand their privilege, and they think they can come and represent other communities without realizing their privilege. In that way, they come to represent and speak for marginalized voices, ventriloquizing them, but not really coming to hear them from their subjectivities. And they cannot understand the structural disadvantages. They bring themselves into public conversation, and they cannot see how subaltern, especially subaltern women who are lower on the ladders, are able to speak, but they're not able to be understood without the mediating factor of institutional gatekeeper. So they can speak, but they cannot be heard. This is a little bit the rhetorical question of Spivak, which tried to put a question mark on this definition of the intellectual as theorized by the Foucault and Deleuze, but also by Said. And she thinks they are very much romantic, and they have no idea what happened in the third world, how this different position of the public intellectual is much more complicated. And this is because the public intellectual have to juggle competing regime of political representation, both individual and collective, play a crucial role among the community as well as in the host society. And I think this is one of the best definition that I can give you of what a postcolonial intellectual actually is or does, which is from Engin Aysen and is included in a volume that Jasmina just mentioned, Postcolonial Intellectual in Europe, that I edited together with my colleague, Adriano José Abed. And it's really about thinking about the function and the role of intellectuals in Europe in order to create new imaginaries. And what do they do and who do they are? And Engin Aysen is also an important cultural theorist, specialist on citizenship, especially Oriental citizenship, wrote this beautiful preface in which he says, what makes postcolonial intellectual postcolonial is the understanding of their location in imperial colonial orders, and what makes them intellectual is the understanding of their location in knowledge power regime. So postcolonial intellectual traverse both dominant and dominated position. Perhaps then post-colonial intellectuals are neither universal nor specific, but transversal political subject, always crossing borders and orders, constituting solidarity, networks, and connection, traversing both fields of knowledge power and imperial colonial orders in that condition of possibility and modus operandi. So it's very interesting, this idea of the transversal in connection to the transnational, because here is not only the question of boundaries, but also the implication of the colonial and imperial relation to which they are attached. And I think this is also crucial and central to the EUTERPE project and also all the authors and writers who you are collecting and thinking with and thinking through. Some of them established, others even more transversal than others. And because with the EUTERPE we are doing a dictionary, I thought it was nice to let you see this project, which is a digital humanities project about trying to think how to map post-colonial intellectual in Europe. Who are they? Where do they come from? Where did they stay? What kind of influences and legacies they are left for post-colonial Europe? So it's trying to create like a map. I remember I mentioned already that I work on cartographies, migrant cartographies in the very beginning, and this was connecting also these two passions with my interest in digital media and trying to see whether I could bring these two fields a little bit together. Like everything digital, it has its own limitation because it's an amazing amount of work for something that seems to be very easy and simple, but I can promise you it is not. So here you see some of the post-colonial intellectual that we selected and trying to think about the impact they have on this notion of Europe or post-colonial Europe. Some of them already mentioned, and the first row is actually all that. So you have Antonio Gramsci, Frantz Fanon, Zygmunt Bauman already mentioned, Stuart Hall, Edward Said, and Aisha Jabara was the very first woman of Maghrebi origin to be allowed into the Académie Française. And she has this beautiful novel, Women of Algiers, in their apartment, which really practice through writing what Gayari Spiva says about Can the Subaltern Speak. It's a very important writer. And below you have intellectuals still active. Etienne Balibar, we already mentioned, but also Gloria Wekker, of course, Dutch, very influential for our white innocent concept. Bogi Roy, Fatima Al-Tayeb, we just mentioned Sarah Ahmed about the phenomenological understanding of the others as stranger. And Johnny Pitt is a very recent, interesting writer. I don't know if anyone is using him, is with his very important book, Afropeans, how to include the African descendants into the space of Europe. And the idea of this project was to see where all these different intellectual will cross and meet. So there is below actually a timeline that you can move from 1800 to 2022, and you can see the main centers of Europe, and you can click on them and you can see what can emerge. I cannot just show you the site, but I suggest you go and play with it because it's full of information. You have a whole list of, for example, what Stuart Hall has done and the way in which his work has been received and archived or part of different memorial and festival even today. So it's of course a selection. With every selection there are limits. And also I've always been a little bit unsatisfied with the notion of the intellectual as someone who is very kind of the individual solipsistic genius, often the white male, an ivory tower idea. And I wanted to move more towards this idea of intellectual as part of collective, part of social movement, and to expand this notion of intellectual also to writers, artists, and activists who really operate in the public sphere and change minds and change the status quo. So this is more what happened in this book, in which Postcolonial Public, in which we think of these writers as a citizen media operator. So they really use their work to have an impact in society at different level. And I think this is also important for the EUTERPE project because you will be all collecting various material, various authors, or writer, or playwright, will allow you to make different inroads into what is Europe or not. And to conclude, just to make it this more concrete, I wanted to give you an example. This is one of the entries that I created for the dictionary on Masa Mengiste, to use this as a way to connect this discussion that I've been trying to have on postcolonial Europe, postcolonial intellectual, in the way of unthinking, rethinking Europe as new forms of belonging otherwise. So Masa Mengiste, I'm not sure any of you know her, is born in Ethiopia in 1974, so she just turned 50 this year. She left Ethiopia in 1974 with the rise of the Red Terror, with Mengiste, the dictator who took power in Ethiopia and ousted the Emperor Haile Selassie. And this is something she also tells in this Beneath the Lion Gate. So she has moved to the United States. She's their professor at Wesleyan University. She received the Guggenheim. She received a lot of prizes. She had been shortlisted for the Booker Prize, as you can see. So she just has 2 major novels, but have been extremely influential. So Beneath the Lion Gaze is the story of this coup d'etat, when Mengiste comes to power and how the whole nation comes apart, the unraveling of a nation taking sides pro or against this new dictatorship. And it's told through the point of view of a family. So you really have a limited vision on what is happening outside. You have to fear the anxiety and the threat and the unraveling of this family from their own perspective. And this was defined one of the best African novels by The Guardian, I think. And then we have The Shadow King, who is actually now being transposed into a movie by Cassie Lemons. I'm not sure when it'll come out. I think it's extremely complicated and expensive to adapt this novel. And The Shadow King is something of more recent history of Ethiopia. It's about the Italian invasion of Ethiopia. You know, the Horn of Africa was an Italian colonial region. And it was colonized very late because with the scramble of Africa, everything was taken. So Italy was very belated and it's called like clumsy form of imperialism, but they colonized Eritrea first. And from Eritrea, they tried many times to invade Ethiopia with not many successful attempts. They were defeated twice, very painfully for European military superior force in Dogali and Adwa. And this war in 1935 is the revanche of Mussolini against Ethiopia and trying to bring a nation to its knee that is still up to date considered one of the few African countries you cannot be said to be colonized. It had been occupied but not officially colonized. And Ethiopia, of course, Haile Selassie is part of this Rastafarian movement, this political organization of Ethiopia with the Rastafarian, which has inspired a lot Jamaican and Bob Marley. So there is the idea of freedom and independence and autonomy very much embedded with this idea of Ethiopia. So in The Shadow King, Masa Mengiste tells the story of the invasion of the Italians, but most importantly of the resistance to this invasion from an army which was very much ill-equipped with very few weapons, but the resistance because they knew their own territory turned into a guerrilla until 1941 when the fascism actually fell down. But most importantly, what Masa Mengiste wants to tell in this novel is not only the history of resistance of the Ethiopian, but the role that women played in the history of resistance, which is usually not accounted for, neither in the historical record, but also not in the fictional one. So she really wants to tell the story of those Ethiopian women who fought alongside men, who even today have remained no more than errant lines in faded documents. So what I come to understand, she says at the end of the book, the story of war has always been a masculine story. But this was not true for Ethiopia, and it has never been the way in any formal struggle. Women have been there, we are here now. But it's beautiful also because Masa Mengiste discovered very late when she almost finished the novel that their grandmother was part of these revolutionary militias. And it's very interesting to think whether this form of rebellion and violence offered emancipatory possibility for women as well as for men. And maybe we don't have the time to think about this today, but I wanted to show how within the history of the female combatant in Africa, there is always this connection to the idea of Fanon, that the colonized people need to avenge themselves through catharsis, reach a catharsis through violence. It's meant also not only in material terms or in ideological terms. And in this novel, we see how women become empowered by becoming militant, but at the same time, they become also vulnerable, not only to the line of the enemies, but also of their own comrades who actually violate or rape them because they will not be subservient as they used to be. So it's also about the history of these women being transformed by the war and their place in society afterwards. And the story of Hirut in this novel is beautifully rendered by Masa Mengiste, who used this idea of can the subaltern speak? How can we give voice to this marginalized position who are actually the blank of the archive without ventriloquizing them? And how do we take hint from photography, from bits and pieces in the archive? Masa Mengiste used to go to flea markets in Italy to visit the family of the ex-colonial soldiers and see whether they had diaries or different pictures to see what was left outside of the frame. And she uses photography as a way to rethink this frame and also to create what Sadi Hartmann called this critical fabulation. From little historical sources, try to knit back the history of those who have been excluded, who have been silenced, who have been marginalized, who have been in play and have been defeated. And why do I get Masa Mengiste as part of this, this is my time, as part of this European project, the EUTERPE transnational project? You could say she's not born in Europe, she's not living in Europe, she's not writing in Italian, even though it's very much part of the Italian colonial history. And this is because we have to think of this idea of transnationality in a kind of wider sense, and with the idea of the Black Atlantic by Paul Gilroy, for example, who very much saw like the Black continent, Africa, the United States and Europe in constant dialogue because of the Middle Passage, because of slavery, because of diaspora. There is a movement across all of them. They create a form of common aesthetic, common resistance. And we can see how Masa Mengiste belong also to this reshaping of Europe through this transnational movement. So even though she does not engage with Italian literature because she does not speak the language, even though she's been quickly translated, she interacts with a lot of the post-colonial writers writing in Italian, like Gabriella Germandi, who wrote Regina di Perle and di Fiori, also about the Ethiopian revolutions, but also trying to expand this Italian canon, trying to think through different way of creating space for different memories, for different history, for different stories. And therefore, in this way, she actually expands not only the Italian literary canon, but the European canon, including other cultural, spatial, and temporal terms. So this is a way of seeing where does Europe begin and where does it end. With the post-colonial intellectual, they are in, but not of Europe. In what way they can contribute to this rethinking Europe as a transnational intellectual, who are also transversal. They belong to many different lineages, but also they are very much embattled with this idea of rethinking Europe and filling up the gaps so that we can have a vision of Europe which is more diverse, but also more inclusive. So this kind of intellectual, as we said before, another universal, not specific. They are not bound to nation or languages, but they are transnational subjects, only crossing boundaries and orders, constituting new form of solidarities, networks, and connection within and beyond Europe.
This podcast is powered by the European Union and the Central European University Library.